Biological explanation for anorexia is split up into two parts, the neural explanation and the genetic explanation. We'll start with neural. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter involved in the control of feeding behavior. Nutrients are essential for normal serotonin synthesis and function because without nutrients and an essential amino acid, tryptophan, that produces serotonin, is prevented from getting to the brain. High levels of serotonin have been linked to the continual state of stress and anxiety. For someone with anorexia, reducing their intake of calories to starvation level, a consequence of this is reducing serotonin levels, may result in a sense of calmness and temporarily feeling better. The brain, however, begins to sense the decreased serotonin production and tries to maintain balance, homeostasis, by increasing the number of serotonin receptors. So the brain is back at square one as it's producing less serotonin but is using a decreased amount much more efficiently. Therefore, restricting eating does not feel as good, so the solution to someone with anorexia is to eat even less. And this is where the person with anorexia gets into a negative cycle and they feel like they are trapped by their own brain chemistry. It works like this. This is a negative feedback cycle. So you have high levels of serotonin, which cause anxiety. So food intake is reduced, and the brain compensates by making more and heightening serotonin receptors, and therefore it goes back to high levels of serotonin causing anxiety, and it goes around in this loop. Anorexics have a high serotonin activity. Their faulty gene, their SHT2 gene, makes serotonin receptors more sensitive and innumerous. The amino acid here is found, tryptophan, is found in most foods. It's turned into serotonin, which controls your eating behavior. Your high levels of serotonin causes stress and anxiety, and it means that the anorexic people will stop eating. It's a vicious cycle because your brain is compensating for this and they just keep counteracting what the brain has done. The next neurotransmitter we'll look at is dopamine. Kay et al. 2005 used PET scans to compare dopamine activity in 10 recovered female anorexics and 12 healthy female controls. The anorexic women tended to have overactive dopamine receptors on the basal ganglia. This is the part of the brain where dopamine plays a huge part in harm or pleasure reception. Increased dopamine activity in this area appears to alter the way that people interpret rewards, which matches with the fact that anorexia sufferers find it hard to associate good things with eating. As for the limbic system, Lipsman et al. 2015 suggests that neural roots of anorexia appear to be related to limbic system dysfunction, particularly in the subcallosal cingulate and the insular cortex. The researchers claim that dysfunction in these areas, whose normal function is emotional regulation, can lead to deficits in emotional processing, which can then lead to the pathological thoughts and behaviors typical to those suffering from anorexia nervosa. Here's the evaluation. Evidence to support the role of serotonin in anorexia nervosa comes from Barbarich, who found that high levels of serotonin was typical of both people with anorexia and people suffering from OCD. And this suggested that characteristics of anorexia, such as the obsession with food and compulsion to achieve perfection, may result from a dysfunction of the serotonin system. However, more recent research believes that anorexia nervosa may be due to an imbalance of both serotonin and dopamine involved in pleasure and reward. And this may partly explain why people with anorexia don't experience pleasure from food and other typical comforts. This was done by Guido et al. In 2005. Sometimes there is a receptor issue. This here shows a strong biological cause, and most people tend to enjoy eating because it gives them satisfaction, so therefore that explains why this problem is in people with anorexia. Some more support comes from Baylor et al. In 2007, who measured serotonin activity in those recovering from restrictive eating anorexia and binge purge anorexia in comparison to healthy controls. There was a significantly higher level of serotonin activity in the binge purge type than the other two groups, and they showed the most anxiety. Therefore, this may trigger anorexia. However, a problem with the neurochemical explanation links to the issue of cause and effect. Research has only identified a relationship between abnormal neurotransmitter levels and anorexia. It's not clear whether it's excessive serotonin that causes anorexia or whether anorexia causes the high levels of serotonin. Also, in normal starvation, the pattern of behavior due to the neurochemical change is distinctively different from that in anorexia, which often leads to lethargy and hunger, not hyperactivity and food refusal, which is typical for many people with anorexia. Therefore, you can't establish cause and effect. There is also a gender bias. It doesn't explain the differences in the number of men and women being diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. If anorexia is biological, then the prevalence of anorexia for males and females should be the same. However, a higher number of people are being diagnosed with anorexia than men. This may be due to the fact that anorexia nervosa has mainly been investigated within the female population. There's also a gender bias of clinicians, which means that the diagnosis of anorexia in men is less likely, despite identical behavior. Men are more likely to be diagnosed as suffering from depression with associated appetite changes than receive a primary diagnosis of an eating disorder. You can link this to NASA's Cairo study. No men were studied, and the Fijian study was only on women. Men are often described as being late bloomers, or they have OCD or orthorexia, and they usually diagnose this eating disorder in a pair. So, for example, like I said, depression with associated appetite changes. However, one last point, there is a strength, and the explanation of this is that it offers treatment possibilities, for example, drug therapies, to normalize neurotransmitter levels, and it serves as an essential support to correct imbalances and support long-term recovery. Additionally, biological treatments make people realize they're dealing with a dysfunctional biology, which is treatable, rather than a dysfunctional family, which often is not. Perhaps the most important implication of this is that it reduces the guilt generated by the view that it's the parents who cause the development of eating disorders in their children. It empowers them, it shows that it's not their fault. Also, drug treatments are quick, easy, and cheap to get hold of.